Hey, what are you watching?
I am about to watch a speech by Obama.
The hard truth is that getting this deficit under control is going to require some broad sacrifice. And that sacrifice must be shared by the employees of the federal government. After all, small businesses and families are tightening their belts. Their government should too.
It's good that both the government and households are trying to get their finances under control and save more.
Well, I'm not sure if the president is completely right to say that the government and private sector can both save and move towards surplus at the same time, especially since the U.S. runs a current account deficit.
I'm not sure if I follow. Why isn't it possible?
Good question. Let's take a closer look by starting with basic macroeconomic accounting identities.
All right. Where do we begin?
We are going to start with the foundation. A balance sheet. Balance sheet keeps track of everything owed and owned. It is a document used to keep track of accounts, and as its name suggests, it must always balance. Let's take a simple example of what a balance sheet might look like for you or me. It consists of two columns, one for assets and one for liabilities and net worth. There are two types of assets: real assets and financial assets. Real assets are physical things such as your car or house. Financial assets are things like a checking account deposit. A financial asset is a claim on another economic unit. In other words, an IOU that you hold on someone else. Conversely, financial liabilities are your debts to another economic unit. An example would be a car loan or mortgage, that is a contract that shows you owe money to a bank. Net worth is a residual variable that balances and preserves the equality. The equation shows that the sum of all financial assets plus real assets must equal the sum of all financial liabilities plus net worth. The first equation shows that net worth is equal to assets minus liabilities. The second shows that financial net assets are equal to financial assets minus financial liabilities.
So to have positive financial assets you must have more claims on others than others have claims on you?
Yes. Let's look at an example. Say that you are a household and I'm a bank. You want to buy a car that costs $100, but you only have $70 in your bank account. You go to the bank and ask me for a $30 loan so you can buy the car. I agree to give you the loan. The car loan is your financial liability. However, notice that it is the bank's financial asset. Conversely, the bank's financial liability is the money in your bank account, which is a financial asset for you.
So now I can buy the car, which will decrease my financial assets by $100, but increase my real assets by the value of the car, $100.
Correct. The total change in assets is $30 and the total change in liabilities is the amount of your car loan, $30. This example illustrates an important point. For every financial asset, there is an equal and offsetting financial liability. The car loan is a financial liability for you, but for the bank, it is a financial asset. Now let's look at the domestic private sector as a whole. That means aggregating all businesses and households. As we aggregate, all IOUs issued to others in the domestic private sector cancel each other out. All internally issued and held financial assets and liabilities sum to zero. The inside net financial assets of a sector is zero.
So that means that for the domestic private sector to have positive net financial assets it would have to have claims on other sectors?
Correct.
What are the other sectors?
There are two other macroeconomic sectors. One is the government sector and the other is the foreign sector, which is also called the rest of the world. Let's first take a look at an example of how the domestic private sector and the government are interrelated. Say the government imposes a tax on the domestic private sector. The tax would be a financial liability for the domestic private sector. The tax would be a financial asset for the government. It receives taxes from the domestic private sector. Now what would happen if we aggregate the domestic private sector and the government into the U.S. domestic economy?
Well, the financial asset and financial liability would cancel each other out, because the domestic economy just owes itself.
Let's take a closer look at the three sectors together and how their finances are interrelated. Across all three sectors, the sum of financial assets must equal the sum of financial liabilities. This is shown in the first equation. Subtracting the financial liabilities of each sector from both sides of the equation, we get the second equation. This means that by aggregating across all three sectors, all financial assets and liabilities cancel each other out.
Wait, could you explain that a bit more? Why do they sum to zero?
Sure. Remember our car loan example? The loan was a liability for you and an asset for the bank. What would happen if you and the bank were combined into one sector?
The bank's asset would cancel out my liability.
Correct. It is the same logic on the macro level. Say England borrowed $30 million from the U.S. domestic private sector.
The loan would be a financial asset for the U.S. domestic private sector and a financial liability for England.
Exactly. So if we were to aggregate across all three sectors, the liability of the foreign sector, England, would cancel out the asset of the domestic private sector.
Okay, so that is what we are doing in the first equation.
Correct. And in the second equation, we are just rearranging the terms so they are all on one side of the equation.
And doing this just illustrates that the sum of all financial assets minus all financial liabilities must equal zero.
Correct. The net financial assets of all sectors combined must equal zero. This means that if one sector has net financial assets that are greater than zero, another sector must have net financial assets less than zero.
Okay, that makes sense. But what exactly does it mean for a sector to run a deficit or surplus, or as Obama said, for a sector to tighten its belt?
Good question. To answer it, we need to look at how outstanding financial assets and liabilities change over time and then what that means for the balances of the three sectors. Up until now, we have been looking at accumulated amounts on the balance sheet. For example, the total balance of your checking account deposit. To consider what it means to run a deficit or to save, we need to look at how accumulated amounts change over time. For example, if you spend $5, the amount of dollars in your checking account goes down, there is an outflow of funds. If you earn a salary of $20, there is an inflow of funds in your checking account. The net change of your financial assets would be an increase of $15. Similarly, if you borrow funds, the outstanding amount of financial liabilities goes up, and if you repay your debts, the outstanding amount of liability declines. Now, what if financial assets increase by more than financial liabilities?
Well, I think it would mean that you have accumulated more IOUs on others than others have accumulated on you.
Correct, and it means that you are running a surplus. The reverse is true if you are running a deficit. Over time others have increased their claims on you faster than you have increased your claims on them. Running a surplus means that the change in net worth is greater than zero. That is, the change in assets is greater than the change in liabilities. Running a deficit is the reverse. So, now we are looking at the changes in the net financial assets of the three sectors. As the first equation illustrates, we can simplify the equation by making a few definitions. The domestic private sector balance, DPB, is the change in the net financial assets of the domestic private sector. The government sector balance, GEB, is the change in the net financial assets of the government sector. The rest of the world balance, ROWB, is the change in the net financial assets of the foreign sector. We can then rewrite the equation in a more concise form. The domestic private sector balance plus the government balance plus the rest of the world balance equals zero.
Okay, so now we are talking about whether a sector is running a balanced budget, a surplus or a deficit.
Correct. This accounting identity gives us some important insights. First, if all sectors run balanced budgets, the identity will hold. This means that the domestic private sector balance equals zero, the government balance equals zero and the rest of the world balance equals zero. What must be true if one sector is running a surplus?
Another sector must be running a deficit.
Right. It is impossible for all three sectors to be in surplus at the same time. For example, let's say that the domestic private sector is running a surplus. What could be the situation in the other two sectors?
Well, one option could be that the government sector runs a deficit equal to the domestic private sector's surplus, and the rest of the world balance equals zero.
Correct. Conversely, the rest of the world could run a deficit equal to the domestic private sector's surplus and the government runs a balanced budget.
Another option would be that both the government and rest of the world run deficits that combine equal the domestic private sector's surplus.
Right. Let's go through a numerical example. To simplify things, let's assume that the rest of the world runs a balanced budget. If the US government spends $10 billion and receives only $6 billion in revenues, what does this mean for the domestic private sector balance?
It would have to mean that the domestic private sector balance equals 4. So, if the government runs a deficit of $4 billion, then the domestic private sector runs a surplus of $4 billion.
Correct.
But if the rest of the world balance is less than 0, then it would not be possible for both the US government and the domestic private sector to run surpluses at the same time. Then Obama is right, and they could both tighten their belts.
While it is true that the identity could hold in that case, it is much easier said than done. It would mean that the US would have to become a net exporter. This is hard to do, especially since the rest of the world wants to accumulate dollars because the US is the international currency and business with the US is strong. Thus, the US must run a positive rest of the world balance. In other words, the rest of the world net saves dollars. But let's look at some data. This graph shows the three sector balances over time. If you add up the balances at any one point, they will indeed sum to 0.
That is a helpful visual. It really illustrates how the balances are directly related to one another. The government balance and domestic private sector balance are close to a mirror image of one another.
Yes, and it shows how important it is to look at all three sectors together to get a picture of what is actually going on, and how changes in one sector are offset by another.
I agree. Unfortunately, what is typically only presented by the media is the fact that the US government is running a deficit that totally misrepresents the fact that the domestic private sector is running a surplus.
Very true. What is also shocking is that the Congressional Budget Office falls prey to this as well. In the mid-1990s, the government started running a surplus. This next graph shows the Congressional Budget Office's projections for the government's balance in future years.
Well, they project increasing government surpluses, but don't take into account what must occur in the domestic private sector and rest of the world for that to be possible.
Correct, and these projections were considered to be great news. The government was praised for running a surplus, and, as Obama's quote illustrates, the government still holds the view that running a deficit is a bad thing. However, what do you notice about the domestic private sector balance in the highlighted period?
It moved increasingly into deficit. That's not such a good thing.
No, it's not. In the first quarter of 2000, the government sector was running a surplus of 1.79% of GDP, while the domestic private sector was running a deficit of 5.77% of GDP. This means that the domestic private sector is taking on more and more debts. Over time this is unsustainable and can lead to a crisis. During the recent recession, the US government started to run larger budget deficits, and the domestic private sector started to run surpluses again.
So, the political and media rhetoric about how the government needs to get the deficit under control is misrepresentative of the issue, as it does not look at the whole picture.
Yes, it is. It is important to move the discussion regarding what is a good or bad fiscal position of the government in a direction that looks at all three sectors' balances, and the underlying implications of a change in the government sector balance.
Well, this conversation has changed how I view the issue, and improved my understanding of it. Thanks.
Of course. It was my pleasure.